Welcome everyone to this webinar on the World Day for Decent Work. This is an important day, but also an important and interesting webinar that we have for you today. It's about living wage for the sugarcane sector. My name is Marit Maai. I'm the Managing Director of CNV Internationaal. But before continuing, let me give you some technicalities. Maybe most of you are familiar with webinars right now because we have all been working digitally and online for such time, but this might be a new interface that you're working on. This interface has the possibility, if you look at the button above that says select, you can select the language. You can either listen to the language that the speaker has, or you can listen to English or Spanish in the translation. Y para los hispanohablantes, hay un botón que pone select.
For the Spanish speaker, just select the Spanish key and then you are able to listen to Spanish. You can also listen to the speaker in his own language, so that's possible as well, right?
We continue by mentioning that there is a possibility for a chat. You can see the chat function. Everyone who has questions, they can put their questions in the chat, and then later on we can share those with the distinguished speakers that we have for you today. We are also have this webinar on video, so later on you will have the possibility to also see the webinar because we will record it, and there will be a possibility to share it later on. And then finally, if you lose the connection, there is a small button with the two arrows. It is the refresh button. It's if you press it, you will be back within a few seconds. So that's the easiest way to do a refresher. You don't have to start up all again. Okay, after these technicalities, let us start with the webinar. As I mentioned, my name is Marit Maai. I'm the Managing Director of CNV Internationaal. CNV Internationaal is a foundation which is linked to CNV, the second largest trade union in the Netherlands. And CNV Internationaal, we work on social dialogue, on labor rights in value chains, on youth employability, and on gender in 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and also in Latin America. And we work always together with trade unions in the countries that we cooperate with. So our partners are trade unions in those countries. And today it's a great pleasure to see that there is participants from over 100, I think there's over 100 participants from various countries and also from all different sectors that are involved in the sugarcane, in the value chain. So that's really a good sign. And I hope that the webinar will be interesting for you. Now, why do we have a webinar on living wage? CNV Internationaal is involved in Bonsucro. As you know, Bonsucro is the organization that strives for a sustainable sugarcane standard in the sugarcane sector. And we are an active member of this organization. We participate together with the trade unions in Latin America that are our partners. For example, in the public consultation on the revision of the Bonsucro Standard. This public consultation was very important for us, and we are very happy that Bonsucro organized this consultation. Big steps have been made within the Bonsucro Standard, but we see there's still some room for improvement in the number of areas. For example, in the area of social dialogue, but also in the area of living wage, our topic for today. When it comes to social dialogue, I think there are already a number of best practices. We see, for example, that in the sugarcane sector in Nicaragua, employers and trade unions are cooperating to improve the situation in that country. And that's a nice and good practice also for other countries to look at. We are very happy that Bonsucro put living wage on the agenda. We feel living wage is an important topic for various reasons. To start with, we feel living wage is important because it's a human right for all employers around the world. But also because we see that investors and governments are more interested in living wage in the various standards, and they also think they attach importance to this standard. We feel that nowadays there is more knowledge about living wage. There's also methods, calculation methods that are reliable on and also available for the sugarcane sector on how to calculate a living wage. For example, the Anker method is a well-known method, and it's also one of the methods that INSEAL and the Global Living Wage Coalition work with. It is our experience that living wage is something that is not just for trade unions and employers. It's something that is important along the complete chain of the sugarcane value chain, and we feel that we have to cooperate also with the people that do the pricing in the sugarcane sector, not just at the beginning but also at the end of the value chain. And that, I think, is why we have this important webinar, today, with speakers from various areas and various sectors. Now, let me introduce our distinguished speakers to you for today. We will start with Joel Fordowind. He is the standards manager for Bonsucro, and he will give us an introduction on the process of the Bonsucro Production Standard revision and some of the suggested indicators on living wage. Our second speaker, I hope he will come because he's not yet in the room, is the distinguished member of parliament from the Dutch parliament, Mr. Joel Fordowind. And Mr. Fordowind, he's a member of one of the coalition parties, the Christian Union, and he has started the initiative this year in Parliament for a national bill on responsible trade and on due diligence. Our third speaker today is Mr. Pieter van der Werf. He is the team lead engagement with Robeco, and he is a team lead on how the Dutch platform for living wage and financials are including living wage in their engagement. So he will share his knowledge and also the views from the financial sector with us later. And finally, our last speaker is Mrs. Carla Romeo Dalmau, and she's the senior advisor of IDH, that's the Sustainable Trade Initiative. And she will talk on the experience with multi-stakeholder road mapping for supply chains towards the living wage. I think this is going to be a very interesting afternoon with distinguished speakers from different sectors. So let me give the floor first to our representative of Bonsucro, Mr. Joel Fordowind. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marit. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, thank you very much, Marit, for that introduction, and thank you very much, CNV, for organizing this webinar today. Also want to say happy World Day for Decent Work to everybody. My name is Joel Fordowind. I'm the standards manager for Bonsucro, and today I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction about who is Bonsucro, what do we do, mention as well a little bit about the standard revision process, how it was done, what are the objectives, and talk about one of the proposals made by the working group, which is to introduce living wage indicator, and what that would entail. So Bonsucro is a global multi-stakeholder non-profit organization that exists to promote sustainable sugarcane production, processes, and trade around the world. Our strategy is built around making a platform of stakeholders in collaborating together to create change in the sugarcane sector. There are three main ways which we aim to create this change. The first one is through our standards. In this case, today, we're going to talk about the production standard. Our standards are it's a comprehensive metric-based standards for sugarcane farming and milling. It allows operators in order to benchmark their performance and see how they are performing against all sustainability metrics. The other two ways are tools and resources. So we also develop and we share resources to help the industry. These could be, best practice guides. We have a calculator to now able to calculate impacts. We provide the direct support to not only producers but also all elements of the value chain as well. And finally, we also host a number of programs and projects that target interventions that address the most relevant issues and opportunities in the sector. So as Bonsucro as a membership-based organization, 1/5 of global purchasing power is included in Bonsucro membership. This is the largest purchasers of sugarcane derived products in the world. And we also have 1/4 of total production of sugarcane is also in membership. In other words, most major sugar milling groups in all major sugarcane producing origins. In terms of certification, we have been certifying since 2011, and to date, there are currently 134 certified mills in 19 countries in every continent, and in total, it's around 6% of total sugarcane production in the world is certified under the Bonsucro seal. This figure grows significantly every year, and our ambition is to be the norm rather for the sugarcane sector. So, as mentioned in the introduction, we are currently revising our Bonsucro Production Standard, which is our main avenue of change, as mentioned. This process goes around every 5 years, roughly, and it takes about 2 years to complete. So very briefly, what's included in the Bonsucro Production Standard. So we say that the Bonsucro Production Standard is our definition of what sustainable production and processing of sugarcane should look like. It's comprised of 53 indicators separated in 5 principles, which are, obey the law, respect human rights and labor standards, produce efficiently, environmental stewardship, and continuous improvement of the production and processing. So now that we've established what it is, and as we mentioned, we're also revising the production standard, I wanted to mention what are some of the objectives. What are we going to be revising the standards with? What is the aim? So the main aim is, of course, is to increase the value of the standard to the producers and to those who will be applying the standards. We will be the main avenue we'll be doing it is by aligning with UN guiding principles and other international frameworks. Also aligning with other main client sourcing requirements to ease the getting the product to market. Also, it facilitates access to sustainable finance. We know that's a growing industry, growing area that for us to be involved in. And also, it's a way for companies to demonstrate both their commitment and improvement of their sustainability parameters. But also, with the view we wanted to revise the standards, also to improve the working conditions and livelihoods of sugarcane workers and the communities around them. And we recognize we can only do the above if we maintain the trust within the stakeholders, and that all stakeholders currently also accept this new framework, our new definition, as the sustainable future for the sugarcane sector. So what is the process for revising the standard? It's an iterative process that's built upon reaching consensus between all different stakeholder groups. Bonsucro is a multi-sector organization and is consensus-based, so it's important that all stakeholders feel involved in the process and also give opportunities to feedback. So The process starts by forming, we formed an independent working group. These are 13 experts with all different skills from the sugarcane sector who come together and they draft the first standard. The first draft of the standard, sorry. And this draft is based upon, first, the priorities identified by the stakeholders themselves. We consult with the stakeholders and we ask them what sort of priorities, what they would like to see in the new standard. And second, the technical advisory board also oversees the process and sets the terms of reference, sets the objectives more concretely of what they want the new standards to achieve. After the development of that first standard, that document is made available to the public for a period of 60 days, where everyone is invited to give the feedback and input into the process. We've just concluded that stage. We've received input from over 200 different organizations in the sugarcane sector, both members and non-members, represented all actors of the supply chain. So we're really happy with with the level of engagement that we see within the sector. Then this process gets repeated. The working group review the comments and take those into consideration into developing a second draft. And then again, a second period of public consultation for the stakeholders in order for them to see how the comments have been that we've received in the first phase have been taken into consideration. And then finally, then they conduct a number of pilot audits, which test the field applicability of the different indicators to make sure that it works in real life scenarios. After that second consultation, then a third draft will be developed and finally approved by your governance bodies of Bonsucro. So in summary, it's a long iterative process to ensure that all stakeholders feel represented and ownership of this new standard that hopes will have wide adoption across the sugarcane industry. So one of the requirements, I would love to speak to you about all of the new requirements introduced into the draft standard, but today we'll just be focusing on living wage. One of them is, the introduction of living wage. But so I wanted to mention as well some of the thought process in the working group of how this decision has been reached as well, and what is the aim for it to achieve. So first of all, what are the reasons for inclusion? What are the reasons that the working group had in introducing living wage into the draft standard? First of all, stakeholder interest. Before the start of the revision of the standard, we did a consultation with all stakeholders, an open consultation, and asked them a series of different questions to gauge their priorities. What would they like Bonsucro to incorporate? And living wage was the second highest priority in the social area, behind strengthening the requirements around forced labor. So it's also an issue of importance to a majority of Bonsucro stakeholders. Second of all, as ICO members in Bonsucro and signing up to its credibility principles, we also seek to work and align with other peer standards operating in other commodities, as mentioned, the Living Wage Coalition, etc. So we aim to align as well our requirements with the different peer standards operating in the scene. And finally, living wage can be a tool in order to diminish social risks present in sugarcane currently. We know that, or there is some evidence to show that, with living wage, with a decent wage, the incidence of poverty go down. There seems to be a reduction of forced labor, of child labor, and other parameters which can assist the sugarcane industry. But the working group also recognized that there are serious challenges or barriers that don't allow for the effective implementation of living wage across the industry, and these are issues that we also have to work upon and develop. So the first one is that there still are methodological issues. Conducting these benchmarks in living wage benchmarks is a long process. It also requires a lot of funding and a lot of time, an agreement of different methodologies available. So that also has to be worked through. So we cannot ignore the issue of cost of production and increasing the cost of production, especially in the cost of production will vary across the different countries. Different countries will have different wage gaps between living wage and actual wages, so that will affect different industries disproportionately. It's also, as Bonsucro is a voluntary standard, there might be some issues of competition between those who certified and not certified. So these are issues that have not been taken lightly. And finally, stakeholder acceptance. In experience from other standards who are working in introducing living wage, they mentioned that the best approach is one where the whole sector is aligned and convinced of the benefits of introducing living wage. So that's a slow a slow, complicated approach involving all stakeholders, so that they feel ownership and agreement to how the benchmark was conducted, what is the wage level, and what is the roadmap towards meeting decent living wage. One area I forgot to mention before in the cost of production is currently there isn't clarity about the responsibility of who has to bear all of the cost around living wage in living wage, the increases in living wage. How is that going to be distributed along the value chain, which will ease as well the implementation of certain indicators that we can create shared benefits. So now that I set the background, the working group created the indicator 2.3.5 titled Movement to Closing the Living Wage Gap. And the requirement is for producers to identify or to map the current wages against the predefined living wage benchmark. That benchmark will be developed by Bonsucro. Bonsucro will take the responsibility of setting the methodology and ensuring that these benchmarks are completed. And the second, and then the producers have to commit to closing the wage gap, so the difference between actual wages and living wages, by 10% every Bonsucro recertification audit, which is every 3 years. So once the gap has been, the difference has been established, close that gap, so progressively increase wages until by 10% every 3 years until the wage gap has been closed. So those are the requirements put forward in this first draft, and they're still under consideration by the working group, who are still now analyzing the comments and will be drafting the second draft. At the moment, we expect the final draft to be approved in July 2021, but that could be subject to change as well, depending on a number of factors. It's not guaranteed that living wage will be included in the final draft. That's a working group decision when and we shall see what the second draft holds. However, Bonsucro will still continue to explore and develop the concept of living wage for the sector, either in the standards or without the standards. And we're actively looking for other stakeholders as well with an interest in this area to participate and to go along with this journey with us. So thank you very much, Marit and CNV, for this opportunity, and thank you all for participating. If you want to find out more information about the Bonsucro production revision, please visit the Bonsucro website or feel free to contact me directly with any questions. My contacts are on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noel, and thank you very much for for this explanation. I think it gives a very thorough view on the work of Bonsucro so far, and on the work on the revision of the production standards so far. If there are any questions from the audience, we will have the possibility to address them to you after the other speakers have had the floor. And of course, people now have your email, so they can all send their emails directly to you. Our second speaker for today is Mr. Joel Fordowind. As I mentioned, he's a member of the Dutch Parliament, and he is introducing a national bill in Dutch Parliament on responsible trade and due diligence. Mr. Fordowind, you have the floor. I have seen Mr. Fordowind on our platform, but he is not in the speakers room yet. Okay, maybe we continue to the next speaker. We continue with Mr. Peter van der Werf.
Sure, happy
I
to.
hope. Yes, I hope you can fill in the second spot, and then we will go to Mr. Fordowind afterwards. So please, Mr. Peter van der Werf, as I mentioned, he's the team lead engagement with Robeco on how the Dutch platform for living wage and financials are including living wage in their engagements. The floor is yours.
I see we're flipping through the presentation already. Can we go to the first slide? So let me just get started with my presentation when we are getting the slide deck sorted. So my name is Peter van der Werf. I'm a senior engagement specialist for Robeco, which is a global asset manager. We're based in the Netherlands, and we have a long track record of working on sustainability. Yeah, for Robeco, sustainability is really one of the key elements in how we make our investment decisions, which we think is one of the factors that determines the long-term profitability of the companies that we invest in. And hence we spend a lot of time in analyzing that and also trying to engage with companies to improve that. For this presentation today, I will be presenting the work of the platform Living Wage Financials. That is a group of investors, initially all from the Netherlands. You see a lot of Dutch names, but now also expanding into France and the UK, where we collaborate collectively to advance the topic of living wage in the various sectors where we have an exposure. Just one question on the slide deck. Are you all also seeing the IDH living wage slide deck on screen?
Yes.
Yes, I think that's the wrong one. Huh?
Yeah, I think we need to have the previous one that was initially up when I started my address. Can we get that back on screen? I'm happy to go ahead, but I think it's easier if
yes, that's it.
The audience is able to follow me. Thank you. Yeah, so can we go to the next slide, please? So, which shows the various participants in the group. So we now have in total 15 members. So these are all either asset management companies, insurance companies, or banks, and pension funds, and all of these investment companies have an investment exposure to the companies that we invest in, to the topic of living wage with the various commodity chains that we invest in. And that can be, in certain cases, in direct production. So really looking at a company that is managing sugar plantations or sugar mill operations. It can be commodity traders, but in most cases it is through the food producers that are buying the raw material to make food, or to the retailers that are ultimately selling those to consumers globally. So that is also where a lot of our work focuses, is on those companies where we have most direct investment exposure. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the platform Living Wage Financials is set up to focus as a group collectively on the right to a living wage for workers in the global supply chains where we invest in. And we conduct our activities through engagement with investee companies. So that is important to frame that. So engagement is a process where we focus on analyzing the company's performance and then setting up calls with the head of sustainability, with people that are managing the supply chain for these global multinationals, and through these meetings and through sending letters and also through conducting annual assessments, which we have aligned with the UN guiding principles. That is where we are able to share our findings with the companies, and then also encourage them to make improvements. We next to that also do sector-wide engagement, which is more based on public statements or letters to regulators, engaging also with standard setters. So I was very interested to see Nahuel's presentation on Bonsucro. I think that is one of the organizations that is also very interesting for us as we advance in looking into sugar as a next commodity chain to also work on that. I think for now we continue to work on the first topics that we have chosen, which are the work on the garment sector, and that's where all of our work started. But now we are working on cocoa and on coffee in the agricultural supply chains, and we are also considering to move into sugar. So let's move to the next slide. So we have 29 companies under engagement for garment and footwear, and we have added last year 16 companies under engagement in the food, agri, and retail space. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of how we look at engagement. So we have various instruments that we can apply. Divestment, which is often seen as an important tool in sustainability, is one tool to set a floor. Engagement on more of a reactive basis to incidents or to reports of NGOs is more of a reactive way. And this group of investors really is looking for meaningful engagement where we really set sort of on a thematic perspective. So really addressing living wage, a topic where we collectively want to see change in those supply chains where we're active. So to really generate lasting change as a financial industry. Can we move to the next slide, please? So for the 2020 Food and Agri Retail Assessment Outcomes, I just want to share some of the insights that came out of all of the assessments that we have done for the companies. Next slide, please. So just to explain a little bit on the methodology. So for each sector, we have a specific methodology developed by these 15 parties where we measure on an indicator level what is the progress of companies on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of very little evidence or zero evidence that the company is working on that specific topics up to full completion where we think the company has fully implemented what we expect from them. We take the UN guiding principles as sort of a guiding framework to also base our assessment on. And we cover various aspects. So we look at corporate policies that set KPIs on living wage and on living income, how the company conducts risk mapping or data gathering, what is the steps in implementation, specifically also focusing on procurement practices, which are really, in our view, key in where the difference can be made. So policy is important, but actually having conversations with the head of supply chain management is often even more important than on the sustainability side, because that's really where sort of the rubber hits the road in terms of the company really putting it into practice. And very important is grievance mechanism. So how are the abilities of workers to also address issues around wages. And the main goal of this annual assessment cycle is to find where progress of the company is, but also what are the gaps that we still need to address in follow-up engagement meetings. And you can find more information on the website that is presented here, which is the website of our platform. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the results on food and agri. So you see that we have defined 5 different stages where we think a company can be based on the aggregate score which they have over all of the indicators that we have set. So in this particular group, we find that all of them have already moved out of the first phase. And particularly Unilever and Olam International have the most advanced practices that we find within this group. And most others are already on sort of more of an average approach, which is indeed already supportive of some of the elements that we are looking for, but there's still room for improvement. Can we move to the next slide, please? And if you then look in retail, that's where we find less strong performance to date. We also have a slightly different set of questions there, a bit more stretching on retail, but we find that but some of them have really very little public disclosure on how they deal with living wage. Some companies, Carrefour and Metro, have shown a bit more already, and we find that Tesco is the leading company when it comes to the approach to incorporating living wage in the retail space. Can we move to the next slide? Can you move to the next? Then we get the overview. So a few companies have made a policy commitment. And this is really where we think, it starts with sort of that tone at the top where global companies are really able to address how they are dealing with living wage. Can you put the next bullet up? Yeah. So companies' stakeholder engagement is really in a very few cases addressing living wage. And I think this is where we find that a lot of other human rights and labor issues start to be more, let's say, commonly addressed, but that we actually have very little line of sight on how companies are looking into living wage. And we find that in sort of one-to-one or bilateral discussions, we get more insights on, yes, we're looking into this, but companies still don't really take this into consideration when they are engaging with a broader set of stakeholders. Next slide, please. So most companies don't really have a full understanding of the conditions, living condition of workers and farmers in their supply chain, and this means that that they are really exposed to supply chain transparency issues that will come out. Next bullet, please. So procurement practices ask for further alignment to enable the payment of living wage. So this is really where I already alluded to before, is that we think that this integration in the work of the procurement team is really important. Next slide, please. And scaling up initiative to support workers remains really challenging. And this is where we find that many companies do an initial sort of pilot project, but they're not able to really scale this up to a broad approach. And it often remains also unclear if companies are really able to provide remediation of wage issues to all workers, to include it in their supply chains. And this is something that we think is really really key, because that is where we find they're not able to deliver. And COVID-19 had a surprising positive effect on many of the retail workers across the globe, because that's where we actually find that in this year a lot of the workers have gotten one-off bonuses, hazard pay, and other elements that really have increased their pay significantly due to the fact that they were frontline workers that really were essential and needed to be supported. So when it comes to total pay and total compensation, this was a bit sort of an outlier. Which sort of is a positive effect that we took note of in our assessment. Next slide, please. Next bullet, please. So what do we expect for 2021? So we do continue to address living wage in relevant policies with the companies we invest in. Next bullet. Next bullet, please. Mapping supply chain to identify risk regarding living wage remains crucial for companies to have full oversight on where they have the biggest gaps in paying a living wage. Next bullet, please. Initiating and scaling up projects to address living wage in supply chains remains key. And this is where a lot of our sort of challenges to companies really focus, because I've spent a lot of time already back in between 2014 and 2017 addressing the initial concept of living wage with companies in the supply chain in one of our programs. And we find that many of them have sort of single village or single region approaches, but they really fail to bring that to scale. And I think that is where the local context is very important. That's the feedback we get from companies. But at the same time, this really hampers them to develop a full-scale approach. Next bullet, please. We strongly encourage companies to provide more disclosure on wage levels. This is often a very sensitive topic, which they deem to be competitive and therefore are not willing to report on that. But we find it very important to be able to assess where ultimately that living wage or living income gap is, and how we then can also assess the sensitivity of the companies we invest in against that. So this is something that we strongly encourage companies to do. Next bullet, please. And informing and involving customers. I think this is where we also find that actually a lot of the I think cost prohibitiveness of raising wages, one of the issues that also Noel mentioned earlier, is very important, because ultimately if you get a sort of consumer premium that is paid for them because they are aware of the fact that all of workers in the supply chain for the product they've sourced are getting paid a living wage, is an element we think companies can still benefit from if they are better able to communicate on that. And therefore, living wage being included in the Bonsucro Standard would also really help in raising the sort of social credibility of such a standard. So that's something that we would also support. Next bullet, please. Next bullet. So from our side, adding new sectors, companies and supply chains. So and next bullet, please. And then, addressing annual shareholder meetings. That's a very natural avenue for us, where as a shareholder, we are able to either address a company during the annual shareholder meeting, or to even raise a shareholder resolution if we think the company is really not making sufficient progress. So this is also an element in our engagement strategy that we will continue to use more. Next bullet, please. And then finally, we will continue, as always, the assessments and to map all of the progress that is made. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. Happy to take any questions in the Q&A later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for your very interesting presentation. I think there are already some questions that I saw in the chat, so we can address them later on. Now our next speaker, or our previous speaker actually, Mr. Joel Fordowind. I would like to give you the floor. Can you turn on your camera? Yes, welcome.
Yes.
Welcome to this webinar, Mr. Fordowind.
Thank you.
We have already in the introduction mentioned that you are in the Dutch Parliament the initiator of a national bill on responsible trade and due diligence. Can you tell us why you initiated this bill this year?
Yes, well, previously, Roelof van Laar, I have to mention him because he applied a law, submitted a law, which was focused on child labor a year ago and still pending. The government has to still implement this law, and they connected this law to the evaluation of the covenants, the sector covenants, and the evaluation has been done now. And in the cooperation agreement for this government, we wrote down that we first want to evaluate the sector covenants before any law or bottom law on international EMVO, I don't know, as
corporate social responsibility.
Corporate social responsibility will be talked about in Parliament. So we have now the evaluation, and the evaluation shows that only 1.6% of all the Dutch businesses are reached now with the sector covenants. So that's a very small portion of the Dutch companies. And even the impact assessment from the different evaluations that we received by KIT and by also the SER were disappointing, and they were saying, well, it's too little time, we cannot get any proof of the impact until now. So this evaluation came out not very well. So that was a pretty firm conclusion that all the parties now, or even the governing parties now, share. And happily now, finally, we can move on to try to develop an initial law that really implement the UN guidelines on social and corporate responsibility. So we've been working on a paper that we have applied already to Parliament, which gives the broad headlines of how a law should look like. And actually we followed the complete guidelines, the UN guidelines, Principles for Business and Human Rights, RIGI framework. And now we are trying to apply that mainline goals into a law, which is quite some work, I can tell you. But we have great help of the MVO platform, and also we have good contacts with different companies, big companies as well, and also the MVO.nl, which is a platform of businesses. We also went to the USO a year ago in Paris. We had discussions on how a law could look like, and we looked at different laws in Europe, like that one of France or Britain. Germany is also working on a law. A couple of countries are working on laws at this moment. The European Commission now took on the effort of also implementing the UN guidelines. It's the Euro Commissioner Reinders. He has announced to come up with a proposal on due diligence somewhere in the end of this year, at least the highlights. And then there should be formed an action plan to implement on European level the due diligence commitment. Well, these are, of course, on the European level. We, as Christian Union, and with me, a lot of parties, I think it's good that the European Commission is working on the due diligence law guidelines, but at the same time, we know how fast or slow the European platform can work. So we said also to the government as coalition parties, we should not wait. It's good we follow the European developments, but at the same time we want to work on our own law. Well, this government said they don't have the ambition to present a law to this parliament. They will probably leave it to the next government. That's pretty disappointing, I think. So that's why we took up the challenge to write our own law, an initiative law, which we've been working on this moment. And the biggest questions, of course, on the law, and it's the same with the law on child labor, is which companies, which businesses are now should implement these due diligence guidelines. Are that companies that work only international? Are that companies that are presented on the stock market? Are that companies that have a minimum level of workers, let's say of 500 or 5,000, like in France? So that are all buttons where you can turn on, as we say it in Dutch. I don't know how you say it in English. Of course, the UN guidelines ask of the countries to let all the companies implement the guidelines. But at the same time, there's also a proportionality within the guidelines. So we should consider the largest size of the companies. But that's a big question we are struggling right now. We have different discussions at the moment. Also, next to which companies should apply, what should they do? How should they implement the due diligence? What kind of surveillance or supervision are we going to choose for? Well, of course, the USO is having this the Dutch contact point for DITCH, and all the members of the UN and the USO members have a contact point, which are there to surveil the UN guidelines and the USO guidelines, the UCE guidelines. So that's an easy one. And the sanctions is another point of discussion, but we don't want to focus too much on the sanctions because we think it's not about sanctions, it's about changing the policies of the international companies to improve the labor conditions and the sustainabilities of the countries. So that's where we're at the moment. We are trying to put a law forward before the end of the year, and hopefully with the majority sustain it and supporting it. Of course, we will discuss it first of all within the coalition parties. But again, if the coalition parties don't support, then because this is my last turn, I want to submit the law anyway. So we'll see how far we will get it, and but the ambition is there. So hopefully we'll can develop this new law and at least have it on the negotiation table when there is a new government to be formed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a long answer to a very short question.
Oh.
Why do you do this? But it's very clear, and I think it's very good that you share that. Maybe a little bit out of frustration and disappointment, you came to such a beautiful initiative. Can you, because you mentioned that you have contact with a number of companies that are also working on improving their corporate social responsibility. Can you share with us the kind of conversations that you have and the issues that you talk about with these companies?
Yes, we've talked to Danone, for example, in Paris, but it's a French or Belgian Dutch company. They have a headquarters also here in Holland. We've talked to Unilever, talked to different companies also on the round tables here in the parliament. And well, the main line and main feedback we get is yes, they want to have an equal level playing field. So they are not punished if they want to apply these guidelines. So they promote having a kind of base guidelines for all companies. And well, some of them are saying, well, let's do it then in Europe, because most of those big companies, of course, work throughout of Europe, and they are now faced with different laws in different EU member states. And if they go outside of Europe, they have other regulations to apply. But they also said, if there's big Dutch companies, please come up then with a Dutch, but try to be as close as the European initiative will be. So they are not rejecting the principle of applying an equal level playing field for all companies. They enhance it. But of course, they have questions on the implementation of the law as well.
They have questions on the implementation of the law. Yeah, I can imagine, because it probably means changing certain structures within their organizations. You have also mentioned already in your first answer the European context. Can you share maybe with us if you've had discussions with DJ Reinders on the European context, or maybe with parliamentarians in Europe? We know there is also an initiative from a Dutch parliamentarian in the European Parliament. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can share a little bit more on your context when you mentioned the laws in France and Germany and in the UK. How can we bring all this together?
Yes, good questions. We had an open conversation with Euro Commissioner Reinders through Skype. It was even during Corona time. He explained his process and his ambitions, which was really respectful. He has a real ambition to move this issue forward. As I said, he has the aim to present on headlines at the end of this year a kind of proposal for the due diligence implementation. So, and of course, he is depending on the Council and the European Commission to bring it a step further. We have talked with the initiator of the French law in Paris. They have another kind of law. They don't focus on due diligence in the process, but more on transparency. And of course, they are more focused on sanctions. So, which would not be our focus. We would try to let companies change their policies so we can prevent child labor, for example, or bad labor conditions on the field. We know the UK has a Modern Slavery Act, which has also a reporting duty on due diligence. So there are different laws coming up at the moment. Of course, we know from the US that the Dodd-Frank Act, which is also trying to avoid products coming into the US that are made with child labor. So I think Reinders is trying to collect all these ideas and laws that are already existing in Europe. Austria is also having this law. And he's trying to formulate a kind of average consensus to move forward. But again, my suspicion is that it will take another couple of years before we have the first agreement on this, because it's already a long... I'm a member of parliament for 15 years now, and I'm studying this subject for many years. So I know it's very difficult to get agreement, even on headlines on this law.
Yes, thank you very much. I know you have to leave us within 1 minute, but let me share 2 comments in the chat with you. First of all, someone who wants to commend you for your struggle, that even after so many years, you still want to have this passed before you leave Parliament. As Wilbert says, there's no quick and easy wins on this terrain, but it's good that you continue working. And Carla Romeo, she's asking whether the living wage is also in your law. I saw in your proposal that you mention ILO conventions 78 and 87 and 98, and also living wage, or leefbaar inkomen as it is called in Dutch, are also one of the conditions that your law is based on. So maybe this is also good for us to know when we are working on living wage, that this is also one of the elements of your law that you hopefully will be still presenting to Parliament before your departure. Do you already have someone who can take up the law, because it's a long stretch, it will not be finished within a few months, so somebody will probably have to take this up once you have left Parliament?
That's a challenge. If I knew, I would be a prophet, because the selection committee still has to decide. Or I think maybe they have decided, but it's not public yet. It will be public in a couple of weeks, maybe in this Saturday even. So we have to see. Of course, I have my preferences for a person, but I have the full trust that the party will select another member of parliament that is very ambitious on this subject as well.
That sounds great. So it's a commitment not just from you, but also from your party.
From the party, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's also in our new party program, and I know it is with more parties in the parliament. So I think there is a base to continue this effort.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being in this webinar. I know you have to leave, but if there are any questions that we still have from the chat, I hope we can share them with you later on, and maybe also share them with the people who've asked those questions.
Please do. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fordowind.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Then we go to our final panelist in this distinguished panel, which is Carla Romeo Dalmau. You are the Senior Advisor of IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, and you will share with us some experience on multi-stakeholder road mapping for supply chains towards a living wage. The floor is yours, Carla. I think you should turn on your microphone.
Maybe, Carla, it's an idea to push the refresher button to see if your sound is going to work.
I think we can still not hear you, Carla. Can you do the refresher button with the two arrows? No problem. We will wait a moment. Maybe in the meantime, I can ask a question to Peter that I've seen on the chat.
Sure, happy to do so.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for stepping in when we have technical problems.
No problem. Go ahead.
There is a question from Francisco. I will read it in Spanish because it's written in Spanish. ¿Cómo considera?
So, Robeco, oh, I can't read it anymore.
Robeco la iniciativa de Bonsucro de incluir en su
What does Rebecca think of the proposal from Bonsucro to introduce initiative with regard to this living wage and including it in the standards, because this could lead to a reduction of the wage gap, taking into account this new living wage concept? What do you think of that?
Thank you for that question, Francisco. Yes, I was very happy to see that proposal in Noel's presentation from Bonsucro. I think some initial reflections from my side. I think it was a sort of a very cautious closing of the gap proposal, which is sort of initially looking for the gap and then looking for 10% closure with every re-audit cycle. I'm not fully sure on how long that re-audit cycle is within Bonsucro, to be honest, but I think that might take quite a while before you really close the living wage gap. Um, I, I think it was very clear from his presentation that there was a potential risk of sort of being cost prohibitive, and therefore they want to really bring all of their members that are in the certification with them. But the risk is that it really might take a longer time. So I'm very happy to see this as a first step. But I would also encourage Bonsucro's members to think of ways where they could accelerate closing that gap to a quicker moment than just in incremental steps of 10%.
Thank you. I think Noel said it was 3 years, the audit cycle.
Okay.
When he had his introduction.
Yeah.
There's another question for you from Mr. Jaap Bartels. How do you measure the impact on the ground, and on what sources do you base that measurement?
Yeah, very good question, Jaap. I think that is really key to a lot of our work. So to give you a little bit of perspective, Robeco invests in 3,000 companies worldwide. So it's very difficult for us to assess for every individual company what is their impact on the ground. So we really need to work with sort of an aggregated level of data and of information that we get through various data sources. So this assessment that we do on living wage, we send out questions to companies. With Robeco, we have a corporate sustainability assessment, so that goes out to all of those companies we invest in, and a large part of that of those companies also answers that. So that's where we are looking for sort of the initial performance of companies. When you then really look at what is happening on the ground, that is where we actually are dependent on the companies and what they are able to report back to us, and we complement that with what we call friends of the partnership. So NGO, civil society. We're also working with unions, for instance, in the IMVB working group, the Responsible Business Charter working group for pension funds, where we are representing one of our clients. So in those cases, we have that network of parties that really work on the ground or have local partners who can support us with fact finding. But that is always on sort of a individual connection base, so on one cooperative or one group. And that is something that we then try to bring back into our assessment. So our initial steps is really in identifying the process, policies, and how companies are dealing with this. The next step is to really measure the impact, or is that living wage gap really closed for specific groups. So that is, I think, the next step, which we also identified as sort of a future growth area for the platform.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's interesting, looking backwards, but also looking forwards at the challenges. I have a question for Noel from Francesco. Noel de Bonsucro. Considera riesgo alto, moderado o bajo de que...
Is there a high risk that that the indicator will be removed 2, 3, 5 in order to reduce the gap with the living wage? What's the proposal with regard to this? Is there a high risk that this indicator will be removed of the new standard, and what can you do about it?
First of all, it's still unknown if it's a high, medium, or low risk. That decision will be up to the working group analyzing all of the comments, which, as we're just conducting, is still not set. However, I will say that Bonsucro is also revising currently its strategy as an organization, so it's evaluating also how to incorporate different elements, not just living wage, into the organizational work of Bonsucro. So it's still some work to be done in defining, and we'll appreciate all inputs into both of these processes.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, I saw you. We can hear you. Thank you so much.
Great. Sorry
Okay.
for that.
The floor is yours,
First
Carla.
time it happens to be, so that's unfortunately. Sorry.
No
Thanks.
problem.
Gracias, everyone, and sorry for this. If we can just move to the next slide. Just briefly, for the people in the audience who doesn't know who is IDH, we are a Dutch-based organization. We are called Sustainable International Trade. We work with several commodities, and we work very much on living wage in many commodities, not specifically in sugarcane, but we have several learnings on other commodities, such as banana, that I will share with you today. Just to briefly mention, if we can go to the next slide, the way we work on living wage is through 5 areas. So first is how you define a living wage, and I hear Bonsucro saying that they will work now on defining a living wage in the areas that they work on. We would be happy to share how we do this. You can see in the screen, we work with several stakeholders. Many of them, I believe, has also been mentioned by Robeco, that they are also part of the work that you do, such as Unilever. So we have these companies on the top that you see. They work with us to find this alignment. We are trying to find alignment on how to work on living wage beyond any sector and beyond any country. And we have also several technical standards working with us, such as fair trade, that I believe are in the call today, and other standards. So we would also be happy to think along with Bonsucro if they would like to be part of this roadmap. The idea of this roadmap is to bring alignment, as I say. So we all know how we choose a living wage benchmark, how do we measure wages in a supply chain, how do we verify these numbers, and how we can close the gap. You can find much more information in the website, but if we can go to the next slide, I will try to unpack this a bit more. What is a living wage? Next slide, please. As mentioned at the beginning, there is the Global Living Wage Coalition publishing benchmarks, but we also know that sometimes we need more benchmarks that are available. As Bonsucro also has mentioned, that they maybe need other benchmarks that may not be available. What we have done as IDH to try to find alignment for companies to know how do I choose a benchmark, right? And how do I choose a benchmark that is respected by the broader community? We have set up a process that we call the recognition process, where we are going to recognize hopefully more than one methodology that measures living wages. So the idea is to bring alignment and to tell companies maybe these 3 methodologies are good for you to use when you want to know what's a living wage in a specific area. So for instance, there is the anchor that published benchmark through the Global Living Wage Coalition, but there is also a wage indicator that some of you may know about, that they also publish living wage numbers. So the idea of this process that we are setting up, we have set up a criteria to see which benchmarks can be recognized, so companies don't need to bother so much on how to choose a benchmark, but choose a benchmark and move into action. If we can go to the next slide, please. The second step, first you need to know what's the living wage in an area, and the second step would be what is the current wages, right? And how far are we from a living wage, what we call a living wage gap. Next slide, please. We have developed this tool, which is called the salary matrix. It's a tool that was first tested with bananas, but now it has been used in many other sectors. The idea of the tool is for a plantation or for a factory, also for the apparel sector, to be able to apply the tool to know what are the wages being paid in their factory and how these wages compare to a living wage. And you may think, well, plantations, they already know which wages they pay. Yes, but the tool also helps companies not only input the wages in cash, but also the bonuses and in-kind benefits that they give to workers. As you probably know, living wage, when you think about the living wage, you take into account the cash wages, but also you can take into account in-kind benefits. Up to 30% of the remuneration can come from in-kind benefits as specified by the anchors. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So here, briefly, you can see the countries where we have tested the matrix. So I believe some of the countries are also relevant for sugarcane, and we have some people in the call from these countries, I believe, and several sectors. We have not tested with the sugarcane sector yet, but we'll be happy to talk with Bonsucro and see if this could be a tool that it could also help you in the sugarcane sector, since the tool is, we believe, useful for any agricultural sector. And we are now going to work also to make it useful for the apparel sector as well. This is going to be, this is now an Excel tool, but in December we will publish an online tool for everyone to be able to use it. So it's fully freely to be used. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks. And just for you to know a bit more what it means to apply this tool, when we talk about living wage and living wage gaps, it can be quite conceptual. So here we have a way to explain it a bit better, and that would be the result you would get by using a salary matrix. On the y-axis, we see the wages that are being paid to workers. On the horizontal axis, let's imagine different worker categories. So maybe the pickers and the processor workers and any type of workers would be added on the horizontal axis. And then we would have in brown the workers that are below a living wage, and we would have in green the workers that are above a living wage. You see the dotted line, that's the living wage in a specific region, right? We always advise to choose a living wage that is relevant for the region that you are working on. And the tool also gives you an idea, as I mentioned, not only about the cash salary, but also in dashed lines, you can see the bonus and in the in-kind benefits. So this would be the type of result companies would get. And it gives an idea of how many workers are below a living wage and what's the living wage gap in a specific factory or plantation. If we can go to the next slide, please. If we can go to the next slide. So the salary matrix data is right now self-reported, but we are working with the standards. So we can together make sure that this data is audited also. And again, we would be happy to think along if that would also be relevant for the sugarcane sector. Next slide, please. And sorry, I'm rushing a bit, but I do realize that I make you lose a bit of time. So if we go into
problem. It's very interesting. Please continue.
Thanks. If we go to the step 4, that's about, okay, at the beginning we need to do all this preparatory work to measure gaps in the supply chain, but at the end of the day, we all are here to close the gaps, right? So here we want to share with you some of the learnings on what we have done so far to closing the gap in other sectors. Next slide, please. Yes. So you see here the one before, please. You can see a timeline here. That's all the sectors that we have worked so far at IDH on living wage. I think it's unfortunately not easy to see, but just I will briefly mention we have worked in the tea, in the banana sector, in the flower sector, avocados, and also from a cocoa and coffee perspective, as my Robeco colleague was mentioning, that is more relevant for living income, but we also work on the living income topic, so how to give incomes that are decent to smallholder farmers. And I will zoom in to do 2 of these projects to share some of the learnings from this work. As you can see in tea, well, maybe you cannot really see it, but we started working in living wage already in 2014. So already almost 7 years ago. If we can go to next slide, please. Now, hopefully you can see it better. So on the tea sector, we have convened with many other players, the Malawi Tea 2020. Some of you in the call may know about it, since it was the first time that a supply chain was looking seriously in the topic of living wage and committing to take action. It was a project where we only look at one producing country, which is Malawi. And as my fellow speakers have mentioned before, we always advise now that when you work on living wage, you do it in more than one producing country at a time to ensure this level playing field, right? So anyway, it was very interesting to apply this project, even if it was only in one producing country, Malawi, because we learned a lot and we also did quite a lot of progress. In this partnership, we had all the buyers, half of the buyers that were buying tea from Malawi in our partnership, and we had all of the producers with us. We created the roadmap. There is many work that was put in place. This year is the last year. And what I can tell you as the first step, of course, was to see how big was the gap. And the gap was very big. I believe it was around 60%. So it means that workers were only earning 40% of a living wage. So that shows the magnitude of the challenge, right? And we put a lot of projects in place. We always say at IDH that this has to be a supply chain effort, right? There is no way one player can solve this on its own. So the pressure is not only on producers, but also on the buyers, on the traders, and everyone in the supply chain. And that's why we work with all of them at the same time. In this case, last year, we reported that we together we managed to close 30% of the gap. And we put in place several projects, and just to mention a few, we work in this coalition to apply in-kind benefits to make sure that workers had, in this case, better meals, so that that help the workers and the working conditions, but this also translated into better wages because meals can be counted as in-kind benefits. And we also work with the buyers on the procurement side of things that also my colleagues have mentioned, right? This is also something that can be done on procurement. And in this case, several of the buyers committed to buy more volumes, and some of them even committed to some premiums on living wage. If we can go to the next slide. Just to mention another very interesting project that unfortunately I will not have enough time, but happy if you guys get in touch with me later. This comes actually from what my colleague from the Dutch Parliament was mentioning, all the commitments that are coming from the Netherlands. In this case, there is a commitment from most of the Dutch retailers in the Netherlands to sell living wage bananas in their shops by 2025. You can see here all the retailers that are working with this commitment, and we are managing and helping them achieve this target. If we can go to the next slide. What we have done, well, first is big news to achieve this commitment, right? And then the first step after the commitment is to map the supply chain. So now we are mapping the supply chain of these retailers to see the gaps, the living wage gap that are in banana plantations. And next year onwards, we will start implementing projects. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I will skip this one. I thought this was interesting for you guys, since I know also sugarcane is produced in some of the countries. You can see here the countries that we are mapping on living wage for the banana sector, which is Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, and so on. as these are the main countries selling bananas to the Netherlands. Next slide, please. Thanks. Next slide. And just some final thoughts. This is my last slide, is just to say how do we do this, right? And as I mentioned, this has to be done by everyone in the supply chain. There is a role for the investors, as my colleague was mentioning, and then there is of course an active role both from a supplier perspective, so from a producer perspective, and from a buyer perspective. From a supplier perspective, what can you do? There are several projects we can put in place with the support of the supply chain, right? It's not that producers need to do this or can do this on its own. It should be projects supported by other parties in the supply chain. But some of these projects could be improve quality and productivity, and this can be linked to increased wages. That's something we did in Team Malawi. Or other times, we need to work on strengthening social dialogue and strengthening worker organizations, also to allow for workers to be able to themselves, of course, negotiate all these increases in wages. And sometimes there is work that can be done on improving income benefits. So here you have some ideas on what can be done on the producer side. And on the buyer side, when we talk to our partners, we tell them several things they can also do. First is commit, set targets, right? I'm committing to buying living wage sugarcane in the next 5-10 years, and that's how I'm going to go there. We are also inviting them to invest on all these activities on the left with the suppliers and IDH. We also co-invest in some of these activities for some of the sectors. We also tell buyers and producers, feel free to use our salary matrix so you can map your gaps and also exchange that between you so you can make a plan on how to close the gap next to the standards. And there is also work that can be done on sustainable procurement. And just to mention a few, buyers could commit to long-term contracts, to more transparent contracts, also pricing. Also, premiums could be an option. So there are several things on the procurement side, as my Robeco colleague was mentioning, right, that can be put in place. And I think I have to stop here. Happy to talk more another time or now with the minutes we have left. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much, Carla. I think that was, I'm really happy that the techniques helped us and that you were able to do your presentation, because I think it's a valuable part of our webinar today to look at the practice also from your side and your experience. There's very little time left, but I still have quite a number of questions, and I think I want to just round up with one question that I have for each of the panelists that are still with us. Maybe to start with you, Carla, how do you start this conversation? How do you make sure that companies and buyers are involved? And how do you divide this the higher income among the value chain? How do you start this conversation with all the actors?
Thanks. From our side, what it has helped a lot is that investors in one side and the governments in the other side have started talking to companies to say, hey, this is important for us, right? I'm talking here about international companies that source these products. So as my Dutch colleague has mentioned, right, the government has expressed to their companies, this is important for us. We will start wanting to see some action, and also investors are doing that. So this is very helpful, because now, to be honest, this was not like this 10 years ago, right? Even if we tried to work on living wage 10 years ago, it was not in a good position as it is now, because now many players are moving. So as there is interest from investors and governments, then companies are starting to move. And then once the buyers start to move, then the producers also are happy to start a conversation, always if it's a supply chain approach, right? If the producers don't feel that the pressure is only on them, I feel always the producers are also open to start a discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Carla. Maybe a follow-up question, which is linked to this, to Peter. It's from Wilbert Flinterman. he asks, how can we get more transparency of procurement practices so that it is possible to determine what a buyer, retailer, or others in the supply chain actually contribute to a living wage?
Yeah, that is a very challenging question, because a lot of that is obviously the sort of competitive elements that these companies have against each other in terms of how they structure their sourcing, what type of contracts, what are the regions even that they are sourcing from. In some cases, we found companies to be reluctant to really be more open on those aspects. So I think that is also where we see to a certain extent that sort of the gradual maturation of level of comfort of companies in sharing some information and finding that they're not losing a competitive edge, and then sort of step by step moving ahead there. That's what we continue to press for. At the same time, it is important that that also regulations are asking for this type of transparency, so that we ultimately know where products are from, how they are sourced, and then also linking that to ultimately those producer groups that are producing the commodities, so that we can create that line of transparency. And this is a very important element that we keep on asking from companies through our assessment and through our one-to-one dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And also a question which is, I think, related, but of course we're talking about money and how to distribute the money along the value chain. For you, Noel, it's from Jesus Esperanza. He has, his question is, do you think that giving a value to sugarcane byproducts like straw or biogases could help closing the gap in living wages and give farmers an additional source of income?
Thank you. Yes, I think this is an interesting question. There's a lot of byproducts of sugarcane which derive their value due to their sustainability characteristics. For example, bioplastics or renewable energy, they get their value precisely because they are sustainable. So naturally, I think there is a role there for new markets and new industries in order to facilitate this. In Bonsucro, we've been working to include these new industries and new markets into the Bonsucro platform, and talking to them about how we can all each do our bit in order to improve the sustainability in the sector, in all fronts, not just in living wage.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think also maybe a final question to you, Noel, and then we will have to end, I think, this webinar because it's 3 minutes past 5 already. How will Bonsucro make sure that pressure for paying a living wage is not just on the shoulders of the producers alone?
So I think this is an important question. I think today we've learned that it has to be a shared approach, and appropriate strategies have to be developed. I don't think that a single one-size solution will fit in every single case. We have to design various different interventions and different models to fit each and every and a case. And I think Carla gave quite a few and a good ideas for us to start the work on different interventions that we can do across the different countries. So look forward to discuss more with Carla and IDH about how we can take this further.
Thank you very much, Noel. And I think we have to finish this webinar now because it's past 5 o'clock, but it was a really interesting webinar also for me. I learned a lot today from the speakers on the different aspects of introducing living wage in the sugarcane sector, the different challenges that we have, from the different speakers who speak from their own, let's say, a field of knowledge, whether it be the financing sector or the knowledge that Carla brought to us from her experience, and Noel, of course, who is in the Bonsucro standard, working on the revision right now. That includes, for the moment, also the living wage. And for us, it's very important that we continue having this living wage. Also because we feel that it's something that, in the end, is part of the UNGA and part of the not only of the guidelines that we should give people, but also of the human rights, as our representative from the Dutch Parliament mentioned in his law. That also in the law, in the bill that he is introducing in Dutch Parliament, this is included. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of challenges. I think step by step, as someone mentioned it in the chat, will be the way forward. And we are very happy that we had this conversation today. As I mentioned, we learned a lot. It was great to have people from all around the world participating. I think they are all the way from Latin America, across Europe, and into also Australia. Some people were participating. For those who still want to see the webinar or listen again to some of the questions or some of the introductions, as I mentioned in the beginning, the webinar is recorded, so you have the possibility to review the webinar afterwards. And if you have any questions that you wish to share, you can send them to us, to the organization, and we will continue. We will forward those questions to the participants. But Noel has already given his email, so you can send them directly to him. Again, thank you all very much for being here. Thanks again to the distinguished panelists for sharing their knowledge and for making this such an interesting afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.